All right, so the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the entire 1930s. And you should know that the Great Depression started, I mean, there were a lot of causes, but what really sparked the Great Depression was when the stock market crashed. After that, things didn't get better, and we knew that we were going through some economic hard times after that. So it's the entire 1930s, and it was World War II. When World War II started, 1939, that the Great Depression ends because it creates all the jobs that were needed. So let's kind of go through this. So at the beginning of the Great Depression, at the beginning of the Great Depression, we had Herbert Hoover as our president. He just became president that year, 1929, and then that's when the crash happens later on that year. It was inevitable, it was going to happen, but he receives a lot of criticism because he did not do enough to get Americans out of the Depression. But this is during a time when the government didn't help Americans. The government offered no aid. There was no such thing as unemployment checks and stimulus checks and all these other things. Like, the government was out of the economy. It was a laissez-faire economy. So it was bound to happen, whether it was under him or a different president. Here are the main causes. Overproduction. We were producing way too much, even though consumers were slowing down on buying stuff. Credit consumerism. People were buying a lot of things on credit, realizing that they did not have enough money to pay back all these payments that they had, the installment plans, and that they had taken out on credit. And then that led to businesses losing money because people can't pay them back. And then businesses slow down, lay off workers, and it's just like a cycle. And then, well, businesses closed down, right? So unemployment was high. Bad banking practices. Banks, they were gambling investors' money, depositors' money in the stock market. And then, people were also conducting bank runs where they all rush in at one time to take their money out, clearing the banks of no money, and that prevented other people from getting their money. And then the stock market crashes due to speculation. Speculation, that's when people are trying to guess if prices are going to rise or prices are going to fall, and their actions actually make it happen. So they were like, prices are going to rise, let's put our money in while prices are low. And it did cause the stock market to rise. And then they got to a very high point where they're like, it's going to fall. So they all took their money out and they caused it to crash. So that's on October 29, 1929. They call that Black Tuesday. And like I said, things did not get better after that. On Black Tuesday, the decline in trade, there was also worldwide trade that decreased. We had very high taxes on any imported goods from other countries. And then those countries did the same thing. They increased their taxes, their tariffs on American goods. So those countries stopped buying from us. And it's just, worldwide decline in trade, just like it is for here. And unemployment was at the highest ever in history. 25% of the country by the year 1933 did not have a job. That doesn't mean the other 75% are perfectly fine. Hours were cut, wages were cut, things like that. A lot of people became homeless, lost their job, couldn't pay rent, had to live out of their car, or they would find open land and build a little shack and they would just live there. And all these little neighborhoods, there were so many, were called Hoovervilles after the president. Many people had to find ways to get food, and charities were the ones that provided food, not the government, but private charities in the form of bread lines and soup kitchens. In the 1930s, there was also a dust bowl that happened in the Great Plains, in which farmers, homesteaders that lived in the Great Plains, they suffered due to these dust storms, but the dust storms were natural and man-made, meaning like the farmers were just kind of overcropping, farming the land too much, it was dried out, deep plowing, pulling the roots out, and then with high winds, the loose dirt just caused a dust bowl of storms. And it was like that for a big portion of the 1930s. Here it is. But the Dust Bowl would make it all the way to the Northeast, actually. Like, it was a real phenomenon. And then Okies, Those were the farmers that left the Dust Bowl and they went to California, mainly to West, looking for jobs. And because they're looking for jobs, the government went ahead and started to deport Mexicans and Mexican Americans to Mexico because most of them were farmers to give up their jobs so that way the Okies can have their jobs in California. Sounds pretty messed up, but even FDR did this. Hoover tried his best to create a bunch of public works jobs, projects to create jobs, but it wasn't enough. For an example, the Hoover Dam, it had good intentions, you know, hydroelectric power to an area that is very underdeveloped because of the geography, right? Nevada, Arizona, but it didn't create enough jobs and kind of failed. All right, so we end up getting a new president because, you know, we gave it 4 years with Hoover and it's time for a change. So Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat, comes in and he comes in, the election's 32, he becomes the 32nd president. He starts in 33 and he ends up being elected for 4 terms, all throughout the Great Depression and World War II. And his plan is to try to fix the economy with his New Deal programs, which are a set of relief, recovery, and reform laws. He passed a bunch of those. These are the ones that we learned this school year, but the ones in bold are the main ones that come out on the STAAR quite often. So we have the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. It provided electricity to the Tennessee region, developing that area because they were severely hit with the Depression. The FDIC, because so many people couldn't trust banks since banks had lost people's money, depositors' money, the government went ahead and passed this law guaranteeing insurance on people's money up to $2,500, and this was just to get people to put money back in the banks. If the banks lost their money again, the government would give them up to $2,500 if they had that much. The Federal Securities Act, or the Securities and Exchange Commission. Securities means stocks, exchange means buying and selling, so kind of remember that. This was created as a reform program to monitor the stock market to prevent another crash from happening. The Social Security Act, this provided benefits to different groups of people. It gives the elderly, disabled, impoverished, unemployed, retirees, single parents, and children who don't have fathers a check every single month by the government. And this is just to help them out because these are groups that, you know, were affected by the Depression and they were already struggling and most of it is out of their control. So that is that. The New Deal, so New Deal laws started to get repealed. And, you know, Franklin D. Roosevelt was really upset about that the Supreme Court was reversing some of his laws. And, you know, this was during a time when FDR was getting everything he wanted. So because of that, since he clashed with the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, he wanted to get rid of him. And, but they felt like he was too powerful. So he tried to propose this idea of maybe getting rid of anybody over 70 years old on the Supreme Court and being able to increase the number to 15, from 9 to 15 judges on the Supreme Court. And if that were to have gotten approved, meaning it didn't get approved, but if it were to have, he would have been able to appoint the remaining justices and they all would have been Democrats and they all would have supported his laws 100%. So everyone thought he was acting like a dictator by trying to reorganize the judicial branch. I mean, that means changing the Constitution. You can't do that. Our founding fathers did that, you know, a couple hundred years ago. So, but you know what? I've heard that there are talks that Biden and his administration are trying to do that again. So it's crazy how, you know, like 80 years later, the government is considering this idea. And if it passes, Biden will be able to elect a whole bunch of justices on the Supreme Court. So, and then, like I said, people felt like FDR was acting like a dictator because he was just passing all these laws. And if anybody clashed with him, he tried to get rid of them. And he did, you know, get elected up to 4 terms. But after he passed away, the government said, never again are we going to allow someone to be in power for so long. So they passed the 22nd Amendment 6 years after he passed away, and that's what puts term limits on presidents, 2 max only. And let's not forget about Eleanor Roosevelt, the very first lady. She was a political activist and, you know, like helping her husband out because of his disability. She was always by his side. Sometimes she would give speeches on his behalf, or she'd go to conferences or meetings. She was also an activist for women's rights. If you get any test questions that are on women, it has a woman's name in the question, then it's most likely having to do with women's rights. And that's that. Oh. So let's go ahead and play that Look It game really quickly. I think right now is a good time to do that, just in case you're falling asleep. All right, so it's right here. So it's based off of dates and amendments, and I want everyone to play, try your best. If you don't know them, then it's fine. At least you get to see them, and then if you get it wrong, they'll give you the right answer. And you can play this on your own. I posted it, well, yeah, I posted it right here. It says book it. And that way you can play it on your own. And I'm actually going to get some more book it games that have to do with the different eras, World War II, Cold War. I don't know, anything that I can find or put together. There are only 22 questions in this game. Okay. So you can play this at a self-paced game. It's right there. And, but this one has like fake money, because other students were telling me about it. They're like, oh, I have $15 million. And I'm like, what? They're like, yeah. And then I guess you can compete with other people and then see who wins. You know, you can tell who wins based off of the amount of money you get. It's fake money, of course, right? But that's just how they can be competitive. Okay, so now I am going to go to the World War II PowerPoint and skim through this briefly. Hold on. Let me take a sip of water real quick. Okay, let's get started. So World War II was from 1939 to 1945. Make sure you learn those dates. It's important to know that. It helps to know your dates, honestly, for the test. That way, if you get a question on the test and you don't know anything about the question, but it has a date, and say the date falls between 39 and 45, at least you know what was going on in history at that time, and you can base your answer based off of what you know, okay? So that's how it helps. So, of course, the United States doesn't join from the very beginning. It was Europe's war. Of course, this is a war that involves Hitler in it. And, you know, as usual, we were neutral. We were keeping to ourselves unless we were dragged in, which eventually we were, right? So it was the Allies versus the Axis powers. And we had tons of casualties, of course, because of the weapons. And then that also includes like the deaths from the Holocaust. And then our president was FDR. He started off as our president, but then he died a few months before World War II was over, the same year actually, and then his vice president takes over, Truman. And then let's see, don't forget that this war is what ended the Great Depression, FDR's New Deal laws helped a lot, create jobs, they lowered the unemployment rate, but it wasn't enough. And this is what actually creates the jobs that we needed. So just remember that it wasn't the New Deal that ended the Great Depression, it was World War II. And the war ends with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan, and then when Hitler commits suicide. So the main cause of World War II is the Treaty of Versailles. As you know, that's the treaty that ended World War I because it punished Germany very severely. And then Hitler rose to power with the intentions of breaking this treaty because it was very unfair to Germany. And, it maybe if it weren't for the treaty being so harsh, then maybe there wouldn't have been, maybe Hitler wouldn't have wanted to rise to power and want to get revenge. So remember, so the treaty took away land from Germany, and Hitler breaks that part of the treaty by invading all the land, taking all the land that was taken away from Germany and just reclaiming it. And then they weren't allowed to have a military or a navy, but Hitler created a Nazi military, built up the military, even though he wasn't supposed to. And he stopped making the war reparations. He stopped paying the $33 billion to the Allies. So that's how it's a cause of World War II. The Great Depression that followed World War I is also a cause because it left countries so economically disadvantaged that they were suffering, and they allowed charismatic leaders, people with extreme ideas that were promising them that they would make changes. They gave them a chance because they were just so desperate for change. And that's what happened. And then here you have the Allies. So as we know, Hitler did a whole bunch of things that led up to the war. And one of the biggest regrets from the Allies is that they appeased Hitler. They gave in to his demands, whatever he wanted, just to avoid conflict. And so for an example, when he wanted Sudetenland, that piece of land, the Allies met with Hitler. Hitler said what he wanted, and they're like, fine, you can go ahead and have this land back. And then he wanted more, and they wanted more. And then eventually they're like, all right, it's time to stop appeasing him because he's going to still take more, and it's just never going to end. So when Hitler or Germany invades Poland, because Poland used to be part of Germany, when Hitler does this move, that is what caused the war. He used a blitzkrieg tactic, in which this is the actual beginning of the fighting. He goes and he blitzes Poland, uses full force military lightning wars, it's called lightning war, on the country. And then 2 days later, the British and the French declare war on Germany for doing that, for invading Poland, a helpless country. So that's September 1st, 1939. As you guys know, 39 is the year that the war starts. After Hitler takes over Poland, he then takes over France. That didn't take long. It was within a month, and France surrendered. The government went fleeing, and the country was under strict Nazi control for about 4 or 5 years, from 1940 to 1944 until D-Day, when we arrived to try to fight the Nazis in France and take France back. The Holocaust is not part of World War II, but it happened at the same time. It's separate. So like some students think that, World War II was fought because Hitler was killing the Jews, because of the Holocaust. Nobody had any idea that Hitler was doing this. He was doing this secretly. Only the Nazis that were in charge of the camps knew what was going on, this genocide. But it's, like I said, no one knew. It's something separate from World War II, but it happened at the same time. So we acknowledge that. And it wasn't until 1944 that the Allies started to close in on Germany, get closer and closer, and they started to discover all those camps, and they realized what Hitler was doing. So he killed more than half of the Jews in Europe, 2/3 of them. Okay, so from neutrality to war, I had told you that we were neutral when the war started. And, as the war progressed, we started to kind of choose a side, but we weren't involved directly. For an example, the British and the Soviet Union, when they were our friend, they needed weapons, they needed ships, they needed planes, they needed all the help they can get, and we were providing that with them. We were providing that for them with the Lend-Lease Act, where we were lending or leasing, things like that. And we were like, don't pay us, don't worry about it. You could give us the items back later if they're in good condition. If not, pay us back later. Take what you need to fight this war. If it means it's vital to the defense of the United States, to democracy, then we will support you. And then Japan invaded China. And when they did that, because we have American markets in China, we warned them to get out. They refused. So we put an embargo on them where we stopped trading. They had relied on us for a lot of resources, especially oil. So when we cut them off, they were upset and they're like, okay, fine. And then they joined the Axis powers, and then they attack us on December 7th, 1941. It was a very well thought out, very well planned attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. We lost a lot of men, 2,400 people. Many ships were destroyed, 21 battleships. Can you believe that? That's a lot. 188 airplanes. It was horrible. And that is how we enter the war after December 7th, 1941. And then FDR gives his famous speech, a date which will live in infamy. This date will go down in history. We'll always remember it. So now that we're in the war after December 7th, 41, we split our military. Half of it goes to fight the Germans and the Italians in Europe, and then the other half is sent to the Pacific Ocean to fight the Japanese. All right, so there are two war fronts, and also North Africa is included with the Europe. Don't forget about Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was the Supreme Allied Commander, meaning he was the main commander, head of all the Allied militaries, because there were a lot of countries that sent soldiers. Maybe they sent 1,000 guys, maybe they sent 5,000, 15,000 from different countries. Canada also, for an example. And we were just taking them all in, and Eisenhower's like, all right, we're going to go ahead and split the group. This group's going to land in France. This is going to land here. This one's going to land here. They're going to go next. And, that was him commanding all the Allied countries. So he becomes a war hero when the war is over, and he ends up people elect him to be the 34th president of the United States in 1953. So he's the president that comes after Truman, all right, because Truman ended this war and then. Okay, so taking back France, like I had mentioned, France was under strict occupation by the Germans for about 5 years, and D-Day, that's the invasion of Normandy. We're invading Normandy, France, but it's all under Nazi control, right? And it was about a 2-month-long operation, Operation Overlord. We defeat the Nazis, and they retreat, and we take back France. So that is D-Day, the first day, June 6, 1944. VE Day, finally the war is over. I'm fast forwarding to May 8th. By this time, Hitler commits suicide, which is today, like I told you, the anniversary. And, it took about a week, and then all the Nazis surrendered. So VE Day, the war is over in Europe. And then Germany gets divided into 4 zones after this war, and that's the Cold War. But then we have the Pacific Front. We're still fighting the Japanese, right? So Douglas MacArthur was like the Eisenhower, but he's fighting on the Pacific Front. And he's the main army commander. And then we have Admiral Chester Nimitz, who's the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, which is the Navy. And, most of the battles against the Japanese were naval and air, because Japan geographically, they're known for their Navy and, of course, for their Air Force back in the day. So Nimitz is known for the Battle of Midway, which is the turning point battle. You have to know that. Midway is right here, very close to Hawaii. And the Japanese were on their way to take over Hawaii. First, they bombed it, and they're like, this time we're going to take it, because that was easy. And we met them there, and there was no more there was no more like the Japanese playing offense. It was defense after this. Now we're moving in. Now we start to island hop, and we just kind of split up our military and just, fight the Japanese on every little island, everything that's in orange, and we just take it back one little island at a time. And then that's that. So Battle of Midway, midpoint, turning point, think of it like that. You have to know turning point battles for the STAAR. FDR passes away in April of 1945, and his vice president, like I had mentioned earlier, takes over. Truman is the one who decides to drop the atomic bombs, little boy and fat man, on 2 Japanese islands. We did warn them though, and it took 2 bombs for them to surrender. And don't forget that those bombs were made through the Manhattan Project, which was created at the beginning of World War II, the nuclear research program to develop nuclear weapons. And yeah, they were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then August 15th, 1945 is officially VJ Day, when the war is completely over. Okay. And when we did that, when we dropped the atomic bombs, we initiated a new war, the Cold War. And this time it's not with the Germans, it's not with the Japanese, it's with the Soviet Union. So even though they were our friend and they were on our side during World War II, everything goes south with them after this event. We never talked to them after that for years, until after the Cold War is over, which that wasn't until 1991. Well, near that time period. The home front, just some quick things that you already know about the home front. Unemployment was at its lowest, meaning almost everyone had a job. It was like World War I all over again. Women were working the jobs that men left behind. We had, it's what got us out of the Depression. We were using propaganda to get Americans to buy war bonds. There was rationing. There were victory gardens. Women were now able to join the military, but they could not serve in combat. If they joined, then they joined WWII, which is Women Army Corps, and they were given clerical and teaching jobs. It's not until later that they actually get to fight in combat. Rosie the Riveter resembled women working those jobs that were left behind. And then we have the Selective Training and Service Act. So selective service, this is the draft, right? This one, 1940, look at that, right before the attack on Pearl Harbor. We were already preparing to go to war. African Americans joined the war, but they served in segregated units, as you know. The Tuskegee Airmen, a group of brave African American pilots, showed how strong, how courageous they were, and how humble they were and loyal, even though they're fighting discrimination, even in the military, because they're segregated. But because of them, that's what encourages Truman to desegregate the military after World War II in 1948. Vernon Baker received a Medal of Honor for bravery in this war. And he's the first African American to receive a Medal of Honor. Native Americans also contributed. Thousands of them joined. And out of all the different Native American tribes, the Navajo code talkers were just the most outstanding of all of them, because they used their language, which is a language that's not written. It's something that cannot be learned. Only Navajo people understand the language, and it was used to their advantage. And this is the only language code that the Japanese could not break in this war. So they were very, very successful and very, very helpful. As you guys know, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were forced onto camps, Japanese Americans in California and Hawaii, with Executive Order 9066. We were just fearful that they were spies, so we couldn't trust them. So yeah, everything was taken away from them, property, businesses, and they were watched for a few years. But then after the war was over, none of them were proved to be spies, and they never got their stuff back. There was a man who did sue the government, this one right here. You have to know this court case, Korematsu versus the United States. He sued because of the executive order. He felt like his rights were being violated. the Fourth Amendment, which is search and seizure, like taking your stuff, and other rights, citizenship, the 14th Amendment. But he lost the court case because the Supreme Court ruled that people's rights are limited during wartime. That's just how it is. And that is, this is a really big event right here. And I won't have time Monday to show it to you. All right, so the Cold War was never an actual war. It was just tensions between us and the Soviet Union that started in 1945 when we dropped the atomic bombs. We initiated that war with the Soviet Union because we began to brag to the world that we were the most powerful country because we're the only country that has this type of weapon, therefore they should fear us. And that just encouraged the Soviet Union to make their own atomic bombs. So the Cold War tensions, there was a space race, an arms race. We were competing for political dominance. We were trying to spread democracy to other countries. They were trying to spread communism to other countries. I mean, there were a few times where we came close to war. There are little wars that actually took part of the Cold War that have to do with the Cold War, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. But that is what it was. And it was from 45 to 91, which is not that very long ago. So like I said, it was communism versus democracy. And just a few things, as you guys know, Germany and the capital, Berlin, were divided into 4. Later on, it gets condensed to 2. That's at the Yalta Conference, where FDR, Stalin, and Churchill are all kind of dividing up Germany. This is when they were all friends and when FDR was still alive. Those 3 also came up with the idea of redoing the League of Nations. And this time everyone joins, including the United States. And today the United Nations is still around today. It's a peacekeeping organization, right? After World War II, like I said, Stalin and the Soviet Union started to go south and they became very eager to spread communism to as many countries as possible. And they took half of Europe. They converted all these countries to communism, while the other side, the Western side, stayed democratic, loyal to democracy. But there was this division between Communist East and Democratic West, and it became known as the Iron Curtain. And that was something that Winston Churchill came up with, that idea. Our foreign policy throughout the Cold War era was containment. Contain communism, stop any countries from turning communist in any way possible, all right? So it's our reason why we fought the Korean War. It's the reason why we fought the Vietnam War. We just didn't want any more countries turning communist and taking over others. So the Truman Doctrine is an example of us trying to carry out our containment policy. It gave money or weapons to any country that needed to fight off communists. We were like, if we don't have to get involved, that'd be great, but at least we can help countries out to fight their own communists, terrorists. And Greece and Turkey were 2 countries that took advantage of this, and therefore they stayed loyal to democracy. We also helped Europe rebuild their economies after World War II. They were completely destroyed, but we didn't want them to go through another depression and a repeat of World War I, where dictators come to power. So we gave them millions and millions of dollars, and they rebuilt right away. And it was also a promise that they would stay loyal to democracy, and it worked. The Berlin airlift, that was, this is a very long event to explain, but please go back and read these slides. On the Berlin airlift, that always comes out on the STAAR every single year. I don't understand why, but every year it comes out on. So, because it's something, it shows us being very heroic, and that's that. So, okay, moving on. NATO, that was our alliance that we created, and NATO is still around today. We did that after the Soviet Union tested their first bombs, and then The Soviet Union responded by creating their own alliance, which is the Warsaw Pact with those communist countries. And the Soviet Union got a hold of their first atomic bomb in 1949. That's 4 years later. We went through this arms race where we got a bigger bomb than they did, and we did, and it was just back and forth until this day. The Soviet Union holds the record for the most powerful bomb, which is a STAAR bomb. We went through this space race. Soviet Union initiated with Sputnik. They put the first artificial satellite in space in 1957, and then the following year we created NASA so we can start to compete and do the same thing. And then we also started to put more funding into math and science classes. The government started to do that to try to prepare kids for, things like that. And then John F. Kennedy was very big on the space race. The space race kind of starts when he becomes president in 1961, and he promises Americans by the end of the decade, we will put a man on the moon, and we did that in 1969, the end of the decade, with Neil Armstrong. There was also the Korean War, in which communist North invaded South. We get involved, the United Nations get involved because of our containment policy, and we contain communism there. We defeat the North Koreans, and today the two countries are still two countries. The 38th parallel still remains the border, meaning nobody took more land than what they had at first. And we went through the second Red Scare. It was very scary. We thought our government was all infiltrated with communists. And it was all because of this guy, Joseph McCarthy, who started to accuse everybody of being communists. Bunch of people in the government. It was literally like the book, The Crucible, with the witch hunt. Everybody was accusing everybody, but it was all false. People's lives were ruined. So this hysteria, this fear is called McCarthyism, named after the guy who was blaming everyone. This always comes out on the STAAR as well. And then HUAC, that was the House of Un-American Activities that was used to investigate in the entertainment business to see if anybody was communist. And a lot of people were blacklisted for that. We had the GI Bill that was passed right after World War II, 1944, I guess a year before, to prepare soldiers for their arrival back home. It's still around today. It pays for their college tuition or gives them a low interest home loan. And these soldiers came back from the war and they started to have a lot of babies, and then it became a trend. So the 1946 to 1964 is the baby boom era. Then there was a need to build a better highway system. And then this is all easy stuff that you should know. Okay, I need to show you guys what I posted on Google Classroom that you have to do over these next few days. So I had mentioned to you that I gave you guys, I was gonna give you guys a test, but I decided not to because it was just too late on time. I don't want to overwhelm you. But those questions that I was gonna give you on a test, I need you to do them. And it will be for a grade, it just won't be a test grade. And this is a really good way to get familiar with topics from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and 2000s. So like the Watergate scandal, that's extremely important. It's a scandal that happened with our president. Scandals are always on the STAAR test. You know, Clinton's impeachment, the Iran-Contra affair, Hurricane Katrina. So I want you to try your best. We're going to go ahead and answer some of these questions together so that way you can get some practice. Now, I haven't really had the time to do test taking strategies with you, just kind of showing you how to break down a STAAR question, what to focus on, and I think it's really important. So let's do some of these. You can open the assignment that's on Google Classroom and follow along, or you can do it later on. But like I said, it is for a grade, and it's under the STAAR Review Materials, March of the Presidents portion, okay? So let me see, let me go back to that. Because I know I have some students that are a little concerned. You know, you may know history very well, but when it comes to taking a test, a multiple choice test, get very overwhelmed, you overthink things, and I don't want you to overthink them, but you do need to study for sure those dates, amendments, and just little things. You know what? I posted this on Google Classroom, this one thing called, it says 100 things that you should know for the STAAR. And that sounds like a lot. You're like, man, 100 things? Well, there's over 1,000 things I have to teach you for the STAAR. But just based off of the pattern of every year, just what they kind of test over and over again, I came up with 100 things that usually come out. And it's right here. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and you're like, there's no way I can learn everything, because I know that's how some of you guys feel right now. If you can just go through that booklet, the EOC booklet, and look for these items right here, here are the page numbers, and just read on those, then you'll be fine. Now I highlighted some for something else. It was a different purpose. And I should have like deleted the highlighting. I think I was trying to show some students something. But like for the amendments, there's a 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, you know, but really these 4 always come out. So if you can focus on those 4, for sure you'll get one of those. Here are some laws, World War II, it's all broken down by era. So that will really help you out if you can just look at those items. And then maybe after you read them, highlight them, check them off, like done. I did this one, I already checked on this one, I already read this one, I know this one, and so forth. So let me go back to this right here. The practice STAAR questions, which should have been your test. And if you don't know any of this, and you're like, if you don't know any of this and you're like, when did we learn this? The Watergate scandal. They're all in the ed puzzles. And if you haven't done the ed puzzles, then you don't know any of this. None of this looks familiar, but you need to do them. So let me show you an excerpt really quickly. All right, this is the best one to kind of give you the example of what I need you to know. So, of course, you read the question, which event prompted this speech by President George W. Bush? Whenever you get an excerpt, the first thing you should do is not read the excerpt itself, but look at the source. So I'm going to do a little bit of annotating. We're on advisory period, so we have some time. So look at the source, look at who said this, who gave this speech, or whoever wrote this. You got George Bush, and then always look at the date. This is how dates help you, okay, on these tests, on social studies tests. If you remember, one of the dates that you have to know that I've been emphasizing is 2001. All right, there's one thing that I've been emphasizing in 2001. By this time, 9/11. All right, so 9/11, that's September 11. So a month later, it's showing you, you already know, George W. Bush is giving a conference, a news conference over the 9/11 attack, okay? And if you don't know anything about George Bush, if you don't know anything about that date and you can't figure it out, then you will have to read the excerpts. Sometimes the excerpts confuse you. Sometimes they don't help. Just knowing some basic information will help. So it's saying, all right, so let's look at, and you should base your answer off of the first sentence of the excerpt, okay? So it says the attack took place on American soil. That's the most important part. So an attack that happened in the United States, to the United States, and it's a conference, a news conference, so it's probably going to be a conference that took place, of course, after the attack to address the attack. It happened in 2001. It was by George Bush. You should already know that's 9/11 attack. And if you look at the answer choices, the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, that's your answer. So everything else are all events that are tricking you. We never taught them. They're not a requirement. Like, they're just random answers. Maybe I'm sure they're true events, but they're random. And you like, because you should know these answers. You should know the majority of your answers on the STAAR exam, okay? So that's why it helps to know the dates. Now, like I said, base the first sentence, or your answer should be based off of the first sentence of the excerpt, because it's like a book. You got the introduction, you have the conclusion. The introduction tells you what it's all about. The conclusion wraps it all up. Everything else is extra details. This right here, all the extra stuff is not going to help you. If you read the whole thing, it doesn't really help you. It's the first sentence that is kind of helping you out. So I hope that makes sense. We're going to go ahead and look at one more excerpt. And honestly, you're not going to know everything on the STAAR because it's a social studies test. It's not U.S. history. It's based off of geography, government, economics, and U.S. history. So, but it can all be figured out. All right. So here you have, let's look at the source. First Lady Nancy Reagan. All right. First Lady means the wife of a president at the time. So you're like, okay, Ronald Reagan's wife. I don't know anything about her. I didn't have to teach her to you. But so the fact that you don't know her means that this is a skills question. You can figure it out. May 1986, all right, we're like, so many things happened in the 80s, but Ronald Reagan was president. Now the question says, get out of this. Which problem is Nancy Reagan hoping to solve in this campaign? Yes. Can you give me 1 minute just so you can listen on this? Okay. So which problem is Nancy Reagan hoping to solve in this campaign? Let's look at the first sentence. Someone asked me if I wanted to make a New Year's wish, and I said yes. And it was that I'd like to see very young person in the world join the Just Say No club. You've heard that before, Just Say No. What are they referring to? Just say no to drugs, right? You've heard it before. This is one of those random questions, but you can figure it out. So if you look at the answer choices, it's the first one, drug and alcohol abuse among children. That's what she's trying to address. So like I said, you may not know everything on the STAAR, but it can all be figured out. Stick to the first sentence. You can read the whole thing if you want, but your clue, your biggest clue will be the first sentence, okay? So, or the last sentence. Anyways, go through this, answer these questions, and if you don't do good, just keep taking it until you get the answer, the grade you want. All right, I'll let you guys go. Monday is our last review day, so I'll see you Monday on Zoom. Bye-bye.